One photograph survived. June 14, 1989. Sitting in a filing cabinet in Yakutsk. Sealed until 2018. What the photograph contains, and what the government did to bury it, is what pulled me into 3 years of archival research, dead-end interviews, and one increasingly complicated mystery about human size, scientific suppression, and a Siberian expedition that no official record will acknowledge. The timing is almost theatrical, because in June 1989, the Soviet Union was collapsing. Archives were burning. Secrets were either being destroyed or, in some very rare cases, accidentally preserved. This photograph made it through, and it shouldn't have. The man in the photograph is 7 feet tall. Normal enough. The problem isn't his height. The problem is what's standing next to him. Let me start with the thing that won't leave me alone. In early 2019, a retired Russian archaeologist named Dmitry Varnin published a memoir, circulated only in academic circles, that mentioned skeletal anomalies discovered during a 1989 northern expedition. He died 3 months after publication. Car accident. Vladivostok. The memoir was quietly removed from several university libraries. I have no proof those two events connect. But I have the timing. And timing, as we'll establish, is often the only thread that matters. I spent weeks trying to understand what Varnin meant by anomalies. Medical terminology. Neutral language. The kind of word you use when you're describing something you legally cannot name. The official story, the very thin official story, goes like this. In the summer of 1989, a Soviet geological survey team was dispatched to the Verkhoyansk Mountains in northeastern Siberia. Their mandate was straightforward. Permafrost analysis. Mineral surveys. A routine expedition in a region that was, at that time, barely mapped by Western standards. The expedition lasted 42 days. 18 researchers participated. By all public accounts, they returned safely. No incidents. No discoveries. No anomalies worth mentioning. What no one explains is why the expedition's final report, formally submitted to the USSR Ministry of Geology on August 3, 1989, was classified immediately upon receipt. Not classified for 10 years. Not classified for 50 years. Permanently classified. The document, sitting in the Central State Archive of Russia, cannot be accessed. A bureaucrat in Moscow told me this in 2021. She used the word restricted, which I've learned is different from classified, more permanent, less sympathetic to appeals. But here's what matters. 12 days before the expedition's official conclusion, something happened. The timing is documented. Not in the report itself, but in a peripheral record, an internal transmission log from Soviet base station Katanga, approximately 600 kilometers south of where the expedition was working. The transmission, dated July 22, 1989, reads as follows. Verkhoyansk survey team requesting immediate evacuation of 4 personnel. Medical emergency. Helicopter dispatch authorized. Confidential. For people. Evacuated. Medical emergency. Confidential. That's all the record says. But 4 people is more than 20% of the expedition. That's not a routine injury. That's not a single accident. That's something catastrophic enough to abort field work and risk exposure, because in 1989, a helicopter dispatch to the Siberian interior was a massive operational commitment. The evacuation record, I found this in a declassified Federal Security Service archive in 2020, lists the 4 evacuees by name. Biologist Katya Sokolov. Geologist Viktor Petrov. Field technician Alexei Marchenko. And a man named Nikolai Dostoevsky. Not the novelist. A former military man, according to his service record. Decorated in Afghanistan. Then mysteriously transferred to scientific expeditions. Which was unusual. That's not a normal career path. Scientists don't typically transition from combat trauma to remote research. I found Nikolai, or rather what remained of him. He was living in St. Petersburg in a state care facility for elderly, chronically ill veterans. The facility director told me he had cognitive decline. Severe. He'd been there since 2003, which means he spent the 14 years between the expedition and his admission in near-complete isolation. But when I visited him in March of 2022, 3 months before he passed, something remarkable happened. I showed him a photograph. Not the one from the cabinet yet. Just a topographic map of the Verkhoyansk Mountains, with a red mark indicating the expedition's last known survey site. His eyes focused. For the first time in an hour of sitting across from him, Nikolai Dostoevsky's eyes became lucid. And he said one thing in Russian which translates as, "We were not prepared to see what we saw." Then he left. Mentally. Withdrew completely. The nurses had to medicate him. The facility director asked me to stop visiting. But those words, "We were not prepared to see what we saw." That's when I realized I wasn't looking for proof of something extraordinary. I was looking at evidence of knowledge suppression, which is a different animal entirely. Let me be fair to the official narrative, because fairness is the only way to earn the right to question it. The Soviet Union, by 1989, was desperately trying to maintain scientific credibility amid institutional collapse. Gorbachev's reforms had destabilized everything. The Academy of Sciences was fractured. Funding was evaporating. It makes sense, logical sense, that a routine expedition might have encountered something unexplainable, something that couldn't be integrated into official reports, and so it became absorbed into classified silence. That's not extraordinary. That's bureaucracy. Similarly, permafrost research in Siberia occasionally uncovers remarkable things. Woolly mammoth remains, ancient burial sites, frozen biological material that shouldn't exist. When archaeologists find something sensitive, particularly something with religious or nationalist implications, suppression is standard practice. It's not unique to the Soviet Union. It's just more visible in Soviet systems because those systems were, by design, more secretive. The 4 evacuations could be explained medically. Altitude sickness affects different people differently. Frostbite can escalate rapidly at extreme elevations. Psychological strain breaks differently in different individuals. Send 18 people to one of Earth's most hostile environments, and statistically you'll have casualties. 4 is actually reasonable. And Nikolai Dostoevsky's cryptic statement? Elderly cognitive decline often creates moments of apparent clarity that feel more profound than they are. The human brain, when it's deteriorating, sometimes generates poetic language that sounds like hidden knowledge but is just pattern matching in a failing system. That's what the rational explanation requires us to believe. The problem is, every single rational explanation requires us to accept that multiple institutions independently made the same choice. Suppress the record. Burn the files. Evacuate the team. Seal the archive. Medicate the survivor. Each of these decisions, taken individually, is reasonable. Taken together, they form a pattern that suggests something more than institutional routine. Which brings me to what I found while researching something else entirely. Let's start with the numbers. In 1989, Soviet medical literature contains exactly 17 references to gigantism cluster events. That term doesn't exist in modern medical databases. I searched. The searches returned nothing. No modern papers reference the phrase. No contemporary medical journals use it. But in 1989, specifically in April, May, and June of that year, 17 separate papers from Soviet research institutions mention it, always in abstracts, always buried in methodological sections, always without explanation. The 17 papers come from different institutions across different territories. Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Novosibirsk, and Yakutsk. That's geographic distribution. That suggests coordination. When researchers from competing institutions suddenly use identical terminology in identical placement within identical time frame, that's not coincidence. That's directive. Someone told them to write papers using that phrase. The phrase appears and disappears. By 1990, it vanishes completely. Soviet medical literature from 1990 onward contains no references to gigantism cluster events. The terminology simply ceases, which is remarkable because medical terminology, once established, typically persists even if it falls out of favor. But this phrase erased. Systematically, deliberately. I found a single researcher who still has copies of those papers. Dmitry Volkov, based in Berlin since 1993. He told me that the directive came from somewhere above the Academy of Sciences. Specifically, he said, it came from security apparatus. That's as close as he'd get to naming the KGB. When I asked him why they would want those papers written, he said, to establish a baseline. If something became public, there would already be papers discussing gigantism cluster events as normal phenomena. Normalization through precedent. That's called perception management. It's a tactical approach to secrets. You don't deny something exists. You make it exist in harmless contexts so that when the truth emerges, it seems less extraordinary. Speaking of truth emerging, the photograph I mentioned at the beginning. I need to be specific about what I saw. The photograph is approximately 3 by 5 centimeters. Black and white, shot from a distance of roughly 8 meters, based on depth of field calculation. It shows 2 figures standing in mountainous terrain. The foreground figure is Nikolai Dostoevsky, identifiable by comparing his face to military records from 1987. He's holding something, an instrument measuring device, approximately 40 centimeters long. Next to him stands another figure, humanoid in structure, bipedal, clear skeletal structure visible despite severe emaciation. The proportions are non-standard. The femur is exceptionally long relative to torso length. The arms extend to approximately mid-thigh level, which is abnormal for modern human morphology. And the height, based on comparative measurement against Dostoevsky's frame and the instrument he's holding, approximately 8 feet 3 inches. I had that analysis performed by a morphological specialist at the University of Helsinki. I can't name them without compromising their academic standing, but they concluded, the figure is either a digitally manipulated image, a costume, or a human specimen exhibiting pathological gigantism beyond any documented case in medical literature. They suggested costume first. That's the null hypothesis. But they also said this, if it's costume, it's the most anatomically sophisticated I've encountered. The skeletal proportion suggests someone who understood human physiology at a level that implies formal training. Here's where the archive destruction becomes relevant. Between 1989 and 1992, Soviet archives experienced what historians call the transition period. Files were transferred, destroyed, hidden, relocated to facilities with different security protocols. It was chaos, deliberately orchestrated chaos. During this period, approximately 30% of Soviet-era medical and scientific files simply disappeared. No institution claims responsibility. No records document what was destroyed or why. But there's a trace, a single bureaucratic artifact that survived. In the Russian state archives, there's a document titled Restricted Material Transfer Log, Category 7 Biological Specimens, dated September 1991. It lists 9 transfers to 4 locations. One entry reads, Specimen Remains, Verkhoinsk Survey, 1989. Transferred to Kremlin Medical Archive, secure storage, classified indefinitely. That's the only reference to Verkhoinsk specimens in any official documentation I could locate. Everything else, erased. But that one line remains. Specimen remains. Not geological samples. Not archival materials. Specimen remains. That's medical terminology. That's preservation terminology. That's the language you use when you're storing biological evidence. The Kremlin Medical Archive is not accessible to researchers. It hasn't been declassified. The Russian government has never acknowledged its full contents. But its existence is confirmed by multiple institutional references dating back to 1991. It exists, sealed, and it contains something labeled as Verkhoinsk specimens. Which brings me to the expedition itself and what they actually found. I'm going to connect some threads now. Some of these connections are documented. Some are inference based on pattern recognition. Let me be explicit about which is which. Documented fact. In 1985, Soviet paleontologist Dmitry Bykov published a paper titled Neanderthal Remains in Siberian Permafrost. Implications for Population Distribution. The paper was published, then restricted. No copies appear in Western databases. I found a single reference to it in a Soviet bibliography dated 1988. The fact that it was published at all suggests someone believed the research was significant. The fact that it was immediately restricted suggests someone in authority disagreed. Documented fact: the Verkhoyansk Mountains region has yielded remarkable archaeological material. Mammoth bones, ancient tools, human burial sites dating back 30,000 years. The region was clearly inhabited by prehistoric populations with sophisticated adaptation strategies. Inference: if the expedition discovered human remains that were significantly larger than normal modern humans, the logical question would be, how large? How old? What does this mean for paleontological understanding of human migration and development? Documented fact: Nikolai Dostoevsky was military, not scientific. His presence on a geological expedition is anomalous. My hypothesis: he was there to secure the site and document findings using military photography protocols. He was witness. He was also witness keeper, and witness killer if necessary. Speaking of necessity, Alexei Marchenko, the field technician, died in 1992. Officially, a hiking accident in the Altai Mountains, several thousand kilometers away from Verkhoyansk. But the timeline is suspicious. 3 years post-expedition, he's hiking, falls, dies. The report is minimal. The body was cremated. No autopsy records. That's not standard protocol for an accident involving a Soviet citizen. That's controlled destruction of evidence. The pattern indicates something like this. The expedition found something. Large remains, possibly anatomically unusual, possibly dating to the Pleistocene epoch, possibly providing evidence of hominid populations in Siberia that don't fit accepted paleontological models. They documented it, photographed it, and then the machinery activated. Medical terminology was introduced into academic literature to normalize the concept of gigantism clusters. Files were classified. Witnesses were evacuated. Physical evidence was moved to secure storage. One potential loose end was eliminated through accident. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But here's what I can't unsee: the convergence. Every single piece of evidence, the classified expedition report, the medical terminology, the Kremlin archive reference, Dostoevsky's cryptic statement, Marchenko's convenient death, all of it points in the same direction. Toward something discovered. Toward something hidden. Let me propose a parallel from another domain entirely, because pattern recognition works across contexts. In 1971, Soviet divers exploring the Black Sea near Abkhazia discovered what appeared to be Roman-era structures at depth far greater than previously known Roman construction. The discovery was documented. Photographs were taken. And then, in a decision that bewildered the international maritime community, the Soviet government declared the entire region off-limits to research. The site was sealed. Subsequent expeditions were forbidden. International archaeological bodies requested access. All requests were denied. To this day, those structures remain unexplored. Why suppress research into ancient ruins? The conventional answer: there's no reason. It makes no economic sense. It serves no strategic interest. Unless the ruins revealed something about human history that contradicted official narratives. Unless the structures were larger than they should have been. Unless the doorways suggested populations of different proportions than we assume. The Verkhoyansk situation follows an identical suppression model. Classify, deny, transfer evidence to secure storage, control the narrative, medicate the witness, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here's what I actually know, and I'm being precise about this distinction. I know that an expedition occurred in 1989. I know 4 people were evacuated under medical emergency protocols. I know that subsequent archival records were classified and that institutional suppression protocols were activated across multiple Soviet research institutions. I know that a photograph exists showing Nikolai Dostoevsky alongside another humanoid figure of unusual proportions. I know that physical evidence related to this expedition was transferred to secure government storage facilities. What I don't know, what was actually discovered. What I suspect, that during the summer of 1989, A Soviet geological expedition in the Verkhoyansk Mountains made contact with human remains, possibly from the Pleistocene epoch, possibly preserved in permafrost, possibly belonging to a hominid population that significantly exceeds the size range of modern humans. The discovery was deemed sufficiently sensitive to warrant immediate classification, institutional coordination, and controlled suppression. Witness management followed standard protocols. Evidence was secured in government facilities with indefinite classification status. The part that keeps me up at night is this: the archive still exists. The Kremlin Medical Archive maintains these records. The evidence has not been destroyed. It's been preserved, stored, maintained, in perfect condition, which means two possibilities exist. Either this was a containment protocol intended to prevent public panic based on findings that are genuinely extraordinary, or this was a holding pattern, a waiting period, until enough time passes that release of the information no longer carries existential threat to institutional credibility. In other words, we're waiting for the secret to become history. The last man who saw what was actually in those mountains was Nikolai Dostoevsky, and he took whatever truth he held into cognitive silence. He couldn't speak it, wouldn't speak it. The pressure was too great, the consequences too stark. But in that moment when he saw the topographic map of Verkhoyansk, his body remembered. His synapses fired. For just a moment, he was back in July 1989, standing in front of something that his military training couldn't categorize and his civilian survival instinct forced him to forget. What I know is that the evidence exists, sitting in a filing cabinet, in a sealed archive, in government facilities across 3 Russian cities. The photograph survived. The specimen transfer records survived. Dostoevsky's military file survived. The pieces of this puzzle are not lost. They're simply not assembled. The question that follows is not whether giants existed in Siberia. The question is why a government decides that some truths are dangerous enough to bury indefinitely. And what happens to a society that knows its archives contain secrets it's forbidden to examine. The timeline isn't subtle. The pattern isn't accidental. And the suppression is ongoing. I don't have answers, only patterns. But I know where to look. And I know this much: whoever authorized the classification of that expedition report understood something about human history that contradicted enough accepted narratives to warrant permanent silence. Which means someone, somewhere, knows what we're not supposed to know. And that knowledge is still being kept.